Chapter 1. The scent of ancient stone and a faint, cloying metallic tang. Blood, always blood, clung to the air in the obsidian citadel. It was the scent of her impending doom, or perhaps his. Lena, alpha of the formidable Silverfang Pack, walked with a stride that belied the turmoil raging within her. Every muscle in her lithe, powerful frame was coiled, a predator on the verge of a strike, not a bride being led to her slaughter. Her silver-gray eyes, usually alight with the wild fire of her wolf, were narrowed, assessing every shadow, every glint of polished obsidian, every unnaturally still vampire guard whose gaze seemed to pierce rather than simply observe. The forced marriage was a political maneuver, a desperate gambit to prevent a full-scale war that would decimate both their species. The centuries-old animosity between werewolves and vampires had simmered for too long, now boiling over after a series of skirmishes and unexplained disappearances on both sides of the contested territories. The vampire king, Cassian, a name whispered in both fear and awe across the lands, had demanded a bride of alpha lineage, a queen from the very heart of their enemy, as a testament to the fragile truce. And her father, Alpha Thane, in a move that felt both strategic and heartbreakingly sacrificial, had offered his only daughter. Lena had agreed, but not to peace. She had agreed to an assassination. Tonight, on their wedding night, Cassian the Tyrant would fall. She had studied him, devoured every scrap of intelligence. He was ruthless, powerful, a being of ancient blood and formidable might. But even kings bled. And she, Lena of the Silverfang, had been trained since puphood to kill. Her wolf, a magnificent creature of ice-white fur and burning instincts, thrummed beneath her skin, a restless entity eager for the hunt. It was a cold comfort, knowing she would not face this alone. The procession moved through vast, echoing halls, the architecture a stark testament to vampire grandeur. Dark, imposing, beautiful in a chilling, dangerous way. Ornate carvings depicted battles, blood rituals, and the eternal reign of their unholy lineage. This was not her world. Her world was the whispering forest, the starlit snow, the raw power of the hunt under a full moon. This was a gilded cage, and she was the fated sacrifice, but sacrifices could bite back. As they neared the grand hall where the ceremony would take place, the air grew heavier, thick with the concentrated power of hundreds of vampires. She could feel their eyes, ancient and cold, dissecting her, judging her. A low growl rumbled in her chest, a warning barely suppressed. Let them look. Let them underestimate. Then she saw him. He stood at the altar, a figure carved from shadow and command. King Cassian. The descriptions had not done him justice. He was taller than she had imagined, a stark column of dark tailored fabric that clung to a frame of lethal grace. His hair, black as midnight, was swept back from a face that was starkly, terrifyingly beautiful. High cheekbones, a sharp jawline, and lips that looked sculpted for cruelty. But it was his eyes that ensnared her. Twin pools of molten gold, intense and unwavering, fixed solely on her. And in that instant, as their gazes locked across the cavernous hall, something ignited deep within Lena. A searing heat, a primal thrum that resonated with every fiber of her being. It was like a lightning strike, a sudden, undeniable recognition that ripped through her carefully constructed defenses. Her wolf cried out, not in warning, but in something akin to joy? Number. It couldn't be. The mate bond. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow, stealing the breath from her lungs, blurring the edges of her vision. Impossible. Vampires and werewolves were ancient enemies. Their bloodlines were anathema, their very existence a contradiction. Fated mates were a sacred, undeniable bond among wolves, a soul-deep connection to one's other half. but a vampire, a king vampire. It defied every law of nature, every legend, every teaching of her pack. Her carefully honed assassination plan faltered, threatening to crumble around her. The mate bond, if truly present, was an overwhelming force. It would scream at her to protect him, to cherish him, to submit to him. It would be a betrayal of her mission, of her pack, of everything she was. Yet, as Cassian's golden gaze bore into hers, she saw no answering recognition, no flicker of that primal spark. His expression remained cold, impassive, a mask of regal disdain. He saw a captive, a political pawn, not his fated other half. A wave of ice washed over the burning heat of the bond, chilling her to the bone. He didn't feel it, or he was denying it with a will forged from centuries of command. The latter was more terrifying. The priestess, a wizened vampire elder with eyes like polished obsidian, began the ancient vows, her voice a low, resonant hum. Words of unity, of blood-bound oaths, of shared destinies. Lena repeated the responses automatically, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. The mate bond thrummed, a persistent ache under her ribs calling out to him. But his eyes, cold and assessing, saw only a wolf, an enemy at his altar. When it came time for the blood exchange, a symbolic ritual where both parties would offer a drop of their blood to mingle, sealing the pact, Lena's hand trembled almost imperceptibly. This was it, the moment. Not for the blade, not yet, but for the proof. If she truly felt the mate bond, then his blood mixing with hers would either amplify it beyond control or confirm its impossible truth. The priestess offered a ceremonial silver dagger. Cassian took it, his movements fluid and precise, drawing a single perfect drop of crimson from his thumb. It hung there, impossibly red against his pale skin, luminous in the dim light. Then he extended his hand towards her, palm up, a silent command. Lena hesitated for a fraction of a second, her own internal war raging. Her wolf howled, a desperate plea to touch him, to accept him. Her mission screamed betrayal. She took the dagger. The silver felt cold and familiar in her grip. Instead of a careful nick, she pressed harder than necessary, a deliberate act of defiance, a silent promise to herself that she was not truly surrendering. A larger bead of her own crimson, richer, warmer than his, welled on her skin. Their hands met, palms pressed together, blood mingling. The surge was not what she expected. It wasn't just an amplification of the mate bond. It was an explosion. A raw, untamed power, colder than moonlight, hotter than a forge, ripped through her veins. It wasn't just her power, or his. It was theirs. Unified, intertwined. It felt like her very essence was being rewritten, recalibrated to a higher frequency. The air in the hall crackled, the arcane sigils carved into the walls momentarily flaring with a golden light. Gasps rippled through the assembled vampires, their cold, ancient eyes widened in shock. The priestess stumbled back, her hand flying to her chest, a look of profound terror and awe on her ancient face. Cassian, even he was not immune. A violent tremor racked his powerful frame. His golden eyes, which had held such rigid control, widened, a raw, almost pained expression flashing across his face. He stared at their joined hands, then at her, a spark of genuine confusion and something deeper, something ancient and recognizing, igniting in their golden depths. The mate bond, once a whisper, now roared to life between them, an inferno demanding acknowledgement. He pulled his hand back as if burned, his breath catching in his throat. But the connection, once forged, could not be severed. It pulsed, alive and vibrant between them, humming a silent, powerful song. Then the cold mask returned, even more rigid than before. His eyes hardened, a calculated fury replacing the flicker of recognition. He stared at her, not as a mate, but as something far more dangerous. His jaw clenched, a muscle working furiously. The power surge had not only confirmed the impossible bond, but it had also drawn attention. Too much attention. The ceremony is concluded. Cassian's voice was a low growl, barely controlled, resonating with a dangerous calm that was far more menacing than any shout. His golden eyes swept over his startled court, daring any to question. But the damage was done. The impossible had just happened before the eyes of his entire kingdom. Lena knew, with a chilling certainty, that her mission had just become infinitely more complicated. The mate bond was a fiery leash, binding her to the very king she was sworn to kill. And his denial, his chilling refusal to acknowledge what had just transpired, only solidified her resolve. He might be her mate, but he was still her target. The wedding night, she realized, would be even bloodier than she had planned. The blood price had just been levied, and both their souls were on the line. She was no longer just an assassin. She was a variable. An anomaly in a war that had just become terrifyingly personal. His gaze, now icy and calculating, promised her nothing but a gilded prison. And perhaps a slow, torturous death. Her wolf, however, whimpered, a strange mixture of longing and defiance. This was far from over. This was only the beginning of their bloody dance. Chapter 2. The moment Cassian declared the ceremony concluded, the silence in the grand hall shattered, not into applause but into 1,000 fractured whispers. The ancient, stoic vampires, beings who had witnessed millennia, now stared with a mixture of horror, fascination, and undisguised fear. They were not looking at a new queen. They were looking at an omen, a living paradox that had just desecrated their most sacred ritual. Cassian ignored them all. His focus narrowed to a single point. Lena. His hand shot out, seizing her upper arm. It was not the touch of a husband, tender and possessive. It was the grip of a jailer, cold and unyielding, a brand of ice that seeped through the fine fabric of her ceremonial gown. His fingers were like steel talons, promising to bruise, a clear message to her and to his entire court. She is mine to control, mine to break. Walk, he commanded, his voice a low, lethal whisper meant only for her. He didn't wait for a response, pulling her along with him, away from the altar and down the long obsidian aisle. The sea of vampires parted before them, their faces a gallery of shock and consternation. Lena felt their thoughts, their cold, analytical minds trying to dissect the impossible event they had just witnessed. Wolf magic. A curse. Did you see the light? The ancient sigils? She has tainted him. Lena kept her chin high, her spine ramrod straight. She would not show them her fear, nor the dizzying turmoil the mate bond was wreaking on her senses. Her wolf clawed at the inside of her ribs, a frantic, confused beast. It yearned to lean into Cassian's strength, to submit to the intoxicating pull of her mate. Yet it snarled at the blatant display of dominance, at the cold, hostile energy radiating from him in waves. He was a walking contradiction, mate and enemy, sanctuary and threat. The walk to the royal wing was an eternity of charged silence. 2 of his personal guards, clad in polished black armor that seemed to drink the light, fell into step behind them, their movements unnervingly silent. They were not an honor guard. They were enforcers, their presence a constant, suffocating reminder of her new reality. She was not a queen. She was a prisoner. Finally, they reached a set of towering, ornate doors carved from petrified wood and inlaid with veins of silver that seemed to squirm in the torchlight. Cassian released her arm only to press his palm against the door. With a low groan, the massive slab swung inward, revealing the royal chambers. Lena stepped inside, and her breath caught. The room was a masterpiece of cold, opulent beauty. It was vast, larger than her father's entire longhouse, with a ceiling so high it was lost in shadow. A massive, intricately carved four-poster bed dominated one wall, draped in velvets the color of dried blood. A fireplace, large enough to roast a whole deer, sat cold and empty. Floor-to-ceiling windows, barred with elegant but undeniably strong silver filigree, offered a stunning panoramic view of the jagged, moon-drenched mountains that surrounded the citadel. Everything was exquisite. Everything was lifeless. It was not a home, it was a mausoleum. A gilded cage designed to display a beautiful, trapped thing until it withered and died. The doors boomed shut behind them, the sound echoing in the cavernous space. The guards remained outside. They were finally alone. The silence that descended was a different kind. Thicker, more personal. A blade honed just for the two of them. Cassian stood by the door, watching her. His golden eyes narrowed into slits, his posture radiating a barely contained violence. Lena turned to face him, the alpha within her refusing to be cowed. The time for ceremony and pretense was over. "You felt it," she stated, her voice steady, betraying none of the chaos inside her. "Back at the altar, you cannot deny it." A muscle jumped in his jaw. "I felt a surge of chaotic, feral magic," he countered, his voice dripping with disdain as he slowly advanced on her. "A taint. Nothing more." "Liar!" she hissed, standing her ground as he closed the distance between them. The proximity was a physical torment. The mate bond sang, a siren's call urging her to close the final few feet, to press herself against him, to seek the comfort her soul screamed for. It was the bond. "I am your mate, and you are mine." Cassian stopped, a mere arm's length away. A cruel, humorless smile twisted his perfect lips. "Mate." He practically spat the word. "You think I would be fated to a beast? A creature of mud and mindless instinct?" He leaned closer, his golden eyes burning with a cold fire. "Let me be perfectly clear, Wolf. You are not my queen. You are a political necessity, a hostage to ensure your father's pack stays in line. The moment your usefulness ends, so do you." Every word was a shard of ice piercing the fragile, burning hope of the mate bond. Her wolf snarled, wounded and enraged. Lena's hands clenched into fists at her sides, her nails biting into her palms. "You can deny it all you want," she growled, "but we both know the truth. The power we created? That was the bond, Cassian. It recognized itself." "It was an anomaly," he snapped, his control fraying at the edges. "A perversion of nature that I will find a way to sever. Until then, you will learn your place." He began to pace before her, a caged predator in his own domain. "You will remain in these chambers. You will not speak to anyone without my express permission. You will not attempt to practice your filthy magic. You will be a silent, beautiful symbol of a peace I hold in contempt. Is that understood?" His tyranny was absolute, his words a cage of rules and threats. But as he spoke, Lena's senses, sharpened to a razor's edge by the bond's awakening, picked up on something else. Beneath the cold fury, beneath the layers of ancient power, there was a flaw in his perfect, monstrous facade. It was a scent, faint and almost unnoticeable, hidden under the dominant notes of old blood and cold stone. It was the scent of ozone, the smell of immense power being actively, forcefully suppressed, and his eyes. For a split second, as he turned from the barred window, the torchlight caught them, and she saw it. Not just anger, but a profound, soul-deep weariness. It was the look of a king who had not slept in a century, a warrior who had fought too many battles and was still fighting one within himself. This wasn't just denial. This was a desperate, all-consuming act of rejection. He was fighting the bond with every ounce of his formidable will. The question was, why? What was he so afraid of? And what of tonight? Lena challenged, her voice dropping to a dangerous purr, deliberately pushing him, testing the limits of his control. It is our wedding night, Your Majesty. Or does the great vampire king not intend to claim his prize? He froze, his back to her. The tension in the room ratcheted up, becoming a tangible, suffocating force. Slowly he turned, and the mask of cold fury was gone, replaced by something far more terrifying. Utter emptiness. His golden eyes were like two dead stars. Do not think for a second that I would ever defile myself with a creature like you, he said, his voice flat, each word honed to cause maximum pain. You will sleep in that bed, alone. You will live in this cage, alone. And you will pray to your moon goddess that I find a way to purge this connection before it drives me to simply tear it from your flesh. The cruelty was so profound, so absolute, it nearly shattered her. Her wolf whimpered, a low, mournful sound in the back of her mind. He was rejecting them. Utterly. Without another word, he turned and strode towards the door. The sheer power rolling off him was a physical wave, a warning to stay back, to not utter another word. Cassian, she whispered, the name torn from her against her will by the desperate, foolish bond. He paused at the door, his hand on the latch, but did not turn. The name is Your Majesty, he said, his voice devoid of all emotion. And you will do well to remember it? The heavy door swung open and then shut with a deafening boom of finality. A moment later, the distinct, metallic click of a heavy lock sliding into place echoed through the chamber. Lena stood frozen in the center of the vast, silent room. She was alone, imprisoned, mated to a king who despised her, who saw their sacred bond as a curse to be purged. The luxurious velvets and polished obsidian seemed to mock her, a beautiful tomb for a living soul. Slowly her gaze dropped. Her hand moved to the top of her leather boot, her fingers brushing against the hidden hilt of the thin, wickedly sharp dagger nestled within. The cold, familiar steel was a comfort, a reminder of her true purpose. Her mission was still on, but the target was no longer just a faceless tyrant. He was Cassian, her mate, a king hiding a deep, weary pain behind a wall of calculated cruelty. Killing him would not just be an act of war, it would be an act of self-destruction, a severing of her own soul. And yet, letting him live meant surrendering to this gilded cage, to his cold, brutal rejection. The wedding night had begun, not with passion, but with a declaration of war. A war she would have to fight against him, his court, and the treacherous, burning bond that now tied her to her sworn enemy. A low, feral growl escaped her lips. He may have locked her in a cage, but he had forgotten one crucial thing. She was an alpha, and alphas were born to fight. He would learn that soon enough. Chapter 3. The hours that followed the boom of the lock were a special kind of hell. Lena, who had known the boundless freedom of the wild, was now confined to a space of cold, breathtaking beauty. It was an assault on her very nature. Her wolf, the spiritual and physical core of her being, paced the confines of her mind like a caged animal, snarling at the scent of stale air and the infuriatingly silent, silver-barred windows. Rage was a familiar friend, a clean, hot fire that had served her well in battle. She let it consume her for a time. She stalked the perimeter of the room, her bare feet silent on the polished obsidian floor. She ran her hands over the cold, unyielding silver of the window bars, feeling the metal hum with a faint, suppressive magic designed to weaken supernatural abilities. It was a subtle drain, a constant leeching of her strength that she would have to fight against. The door was solid, ancient wood reinforced with iron, impenetrable. Cassian had not been careless. When the initial fury ebbed, it left behind the cold, sharp focus of an alpha. This was no longer a simple mission, it was a campaign. And this room was her first battlefield. She had one weapon, the dagger in her boot, and one invaluable secret asset: her ability to read the minds of those she touched. An ability no one here, not even her mate, knew she possessed. The irony was a bitter pill. Cassian, the tyrant who demanded complete control, was blind to the most intimate invasion of all. As she stood in the center of the room, the silence began to press in on her. But it wasn't empty. It was filled with him. The mate bond was a phantom limb, an invisible cord that stretched from her soul to his, no matter the distance. It was a constant, agonizing pull, a deep, resonant ache in her chest that was both exquisitely painful and undeniably alluring. Through it, she could feel the turbulent storm of his emotions. Not the cold, empty cruelty he had shown her, but a maelstrom of fury, frustration, and a jagged, relentless pressure. It was the weight of a crown, the burden of a kingdom, and something else. A deep, gnawing anxiety that felt ancient and raw. He was fighting the bond, yes, but he was fighting other battles too. Battles that were draining his immense power. She lay on the massive, blood-red bed. Not for rest, but to think. The fine-spun sheets were cold, devoid of any warmth, any trace of him. She had expected to be repulsed, but the bond made her crave his scent, his presence, with a desperation that shamed her. To want the touch of the man she had to kill was a profound betrayal of herself. The bond was a parasite, feeding on her resolve, trying to twist her purpose into something soft and submissive. She would not let it. She would use it. She would let it be her guide to his weaknesses, a map to the heart she was sworn to stop. Morning came, not with a gentle dawn, but with a gray, lifeless light that filtered through the barred windows, painting the obsidian floors in shades of ash. Soon after, she heard the heavy lock being drawn back. Lena moved to the center of the room, her stance deceptively relaxed, her senses on high alert. 2 vampire servants entered, their movements silent and graceful. One was an older male, his face a mask of stoic indifference. The other was a young girl, barely more than a fledgling by vampire standards, her eyes wide with a palpable terror. They carried a tray with a silver cloche, a pitcher of water, and fresh linens. They did not look at her directly, their gazes fixed on the floor a few feet in front of them. Lena remained silent, watching them. The girl's hands trembled so violently that the water in the pitcher sloshed, spilling a few drops onto the polished floor. The older vampire shot her a look of pure venom, a silent, vicious warning. The girl flinched as if struck. Lena's wolf bristled. The blatant display of fear and dominance was common in vampire hierarchies, a brutal system of power she found repulsive. They clearly saw her as a monster, a rabid wolf brought into their pristine home. Let them. Fear was a tool. The older servant placed the tray on a small table. "Your meal, Your Majesty," he said, his voice a dry rustle of old parchment. The title was a mockery, a deliberate jab. Lena ignored it. "Leave it," she said, her voice intentionally cold and dismissive. As they turned to leave, Lena moved with the fluid speed of a predator. She stepped directly into the young girl's path. The girl froze, her eyes widening further in absolute panic, a small gasp escaping her lips. "You dropped something," Lena said, her voice softening just a fraction. In her haste, a small linen napkin had slipped from the girl's trembling grasp. The girl stared at it, then at Lena, seemingly paralyzed by fear. "Pick it up," the older servant commanded from the doorway, his voice sharp with impatience. Lena bent down, her movements slow and deliberate, and picked up the napkin herself. As she straightened, she held it out to the girl. "Here." The girl hesitated, her eyes darting from Lena's face to the older vampire at the door. Trembling, she reached out to take it. The moment her cold, delicate fingers brushed against Lena's, the world shifted. Lena was prepared for the girl's thoughts to be a torrent of fear directed at her, the Wolf Queen, the enemy. She's going to kill me. The beast will rip out my throat. Please don't let her touch me. But what she received was so much worse. So profoundly unexpected, it almost made her stagger. The girl's surface thoughts were indeed of fear. But the deeper, overwhelming terror, the true source of her trembling, had nothing to do with Lena. It was a chilling, desperate litany of dread. Don't let it be me next. Mother said it starts with the cold, the gray in the veins. Saw Lord Valerius yesterday. His eyes were like dust. He didn't even recognize his own son. The king. He works so hard. The rituals, the blood tithes. But it's not working. The withering spreads. The shriek took my cousin last month. They say you can hear their souls tearing apart. Don't let it be me. Don't let me wither. The thoughts were a chaotic, terrifying flood of information. A disease. A plague called the Withering. Something that stole memories, turned eyes to dust, and ended in a soul-tearing shriek. A sickness that not even Cassian, with all his power and his blood rituals, could stop. Lena's hand dropped, the napkin falling unheeded to the floor. The girl snatched her hand back, whimpering, and scurried out of the room, the older servant dragging her through the door, before it boomed shut, and the lock slid home once more. Lena stood motionless, the girl's terrifying thoughts echoing in her mind. The Withering. Suddenly, Cassian's actions began to reframe themselves in a horrifying new light. The blood tithes, seen by the werewolves as an act of vampiric greed and aggression, were they actually a desperate attempt to find a cure? His constant pressure, the anxiety she felt through the bond. Was it the weight of a king watching his people slowly, horribly die? His tyranny? Was it not the act of a conqueror, but the desperate, brutal measures of a leader trying to maintain order in the face of an unstoppable plague, hiding a devastating weakness from his enemies? The entire premise of her mission, the foundation of the impending war, was built on a lie. Not a vampire lie, but a lie born of misunderstanding, of ancient hatred that blinded both sides to the truth. Her pack thought the vampires were stockpiling power for an invasion. They were actually fighting a losing battle against extinction. Her target was not a tyrant collecting power for conquest. He was a king trying to save his people from a fate worse than death. A king who had just been shackled by a mate bond to the daughter of his greatest enemy. An enemy who could use this devastating secret to bring his entire kingdom to its knees. His rejection of her, his cold cruelty. It was not just pride. It was fear. A profound, desperate fear that the bond would expose his people's greatest vulnerability. That she was the greatest threat he had ever faced, not because she was an assassin, but because, as his mate, she was the one being who could get close enough to see the truth. The dagger in her boot suddenly felt impossibly heavy. How could she kill a man who was fighting such a desperate battle? But how could she not? Her people were still dying in border skirmishes, still viewed as enemies. This new knowledge didn't erase the blood spilled between their kinds. A wave of dizziness washed over her. She gripped the back of a heavy chair to steady herself, her knuckles white. The gilded cage was no longer just a prison. It was a vantage point, a place from which she had seen a truth that would change everything. The long day bled into a twilight of confusion and turmoil. As darkness fell, the sound of the lock scraping open again jolted her from her thoughts. Cassian swept into the room, his long coat swirling around him like a cape of shadows. The air crackled with his fury, a raw, palpable rage that was far more intense than before. Through the bond, she could feel it was not directed at her, but at something else. A fury born of failure, of utter frustration. His golden eyes, blazing with a dangerous light, found hers across the room. "My counsel is demanding your head," he snarled, his voice a low, vicious growl that vibrated through the floor. "The power surge at the ceremony. They are calling you a curse, an agent of chaos sent to unravel my kingdom. They say your blood has tainted our sacred rites and that you must be purged." He stalked towards her, his beautiful face a mask of cold, lethal anger. "And after the events of today, I am finding it very, very difficult to disagree with them." He stopped before her, his presence an overwhelming storm of power and rage. "Tell me, Wolf," he whispered, his voice dropping to a deadly calm. "What secrets are you hiding?" Chapter 4. Cassian's accusation hung in the air, a physical weight that pressed down on Lena. His fury was a living thing, a storm of gold and shadow contained within his powerful frame. She could feel it battering against her through the mate bond, a raw, desperate rage born of helplessness. Her own anger, her own fear, felt insignificant in the face of the hurricane that was him. He was looking for a target, a place to direct the frustration of a king whose power was failing him, and she, the wolf in his den, was the most convenient one. "Secrets?" Lena let out a short, incredulous laugh, a sound as sharp as breaking glass. The alpha in her rose to the challenge, refusing to be his scapegoat. "You lock me in this gilded cage, you speak of me as a taint, a beast, and you dare to ask me about secrets." She took a deliberate step forward, closing the distance he had created, forcing him to hold his ground or retreat. A king like Cassian would never retreat. "The only secrets in this room, Your Majesty, are the ones you keep." His eyes narrowed, the gold within them flaring with dangerous intensity. "Do not play games with me, Wolf." "The girl you touched this morning." "Ilara. She belongs to Lord Vorlag's household. Vorlag sits on my council. He came to me an hour ago, convinced you had placed a hex on the child. He claims you probed her mind, searching for weaknesses in his bloodline. He is now leading the call for your execution." The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. Her simple act of reaching out, of trying to understand the source of the servant's fear, had been seen as an act of espionage. In this den of paranoia and hidden sickness, kindness was indistinguishable from aggression. "I did nothing but return a dropped napkin," Lena stated, her voice a low, level counterpoint to his fury. "If your councilmen are so terrified of a simple touch, perhaps it is because they have much to hide." She let the accusation hang in the air, a deliberate prod at the hornet's nest she now knew was buzzing just beneath the surface of his court. "You are insolent!" Cassian snarled, taking a step that brought him so close she could feel the cold radiating from his body. The bond between them flared violently at the proximity, a desperate, searing heat that belied the chill of his skin. It was a dizzying contradiction, a war of sensation within her own body. "You reek of defiance. You think because of that anomaly at the altar that you hold some power here. You hold nothing. You are nothing but a breath away from my judgment." For a fleeting moment, as the bond surged, a wave of vertigo washed over him. He swayed almost imperceptibly, one hand clenching into a fist at his side. The mask of perfect, immortal control cracked, and beneath it, she saw a flicker of profound exhaustion, of a power stretched to its breaking point. The ozone scent she'd noticed before was stronger now, the distinct smell of a dam about to burst. He was weak, not physically weak. His power was still immense, a mountain to her hill. But his spirit, his core, was frayed, worn thin by centuries of a secret, losing battle. This was her chance. Not to kill him, but to know him. To confirm the terrifying truth she had glimpsed in the servant girl's mind. With a fluid motion, Lena turned away from him, a calculated act of dismissal. "I am tired of this conversation. Your paranoia is as vast and empty as these chambers." She started to walk toward the cold fireplace, deliberately putting her back to him, an act no sane creature would dare in the presence of an enraged vampire king. It was an invitation, a challenge. She was daring him to stop her. The air behind her shifted. She felt him move before she heard him, a predator's silent lunge. His hand clamped down on her shoulder, his fingers digging into her flesh like claws of ice. He spun her around, forcing her to face him, his face inches from hers, his golden eyes blazing with a fury that was now entirely, terrifyingly personal. "You will not turn your back on me," he hissed. "You will not." The moment his skin touched hers, the universe fractured. It wasn't like the gentle probe she'd used on the servant girl. His mind was not a stream. It was a raging, ancient ocean, and the contact ripped the floodgates open. She was drowning, pulled under by a torrent of memories, emotions, and pain so profound it stole the air from her lungs. She saw images, not as thoughts, but as visceral, living moments. A great hall, much like this one, but filled with laughter. A beautiful vampire queen with eyes the color of amethysts, smiling at him. His mother. Then the queen's face, graying, her eyes turning to dust. The memory of her final, soul-tearing scream, the shriek, echoing in the stone. His father, a stern king with eyes of gold just like his, placing a heavy obsidian crown on Cassian's young head. The weight was not just physical, it was the crushing burden of a dying race. "You must find a cure, my son. You must not let our light go out." Centuries of desperate, bloody rituals, alchemical experiments, ancient texts scoured until the pages turned to dust, every attempt ending in failure, every failure marked by another shriek echoing from the noble houses, a constant, horrifying reminder of the clock that was ticking down to their extinction. The face of Lord Vorlag, not angry, but weeping, holding the hand of his withered, unrecognizing wife. The face of the servant girl, Elara, looking at her own mother with that same dawning terror. And beneath it all, a loneliness so absolute, so vast and cold, it was like the space between stars. The crushing isolation of a king who could not show weakness, who had to be a tyrant to hide his people's terminal fragility, who had carried this apocalyptic secret alone for centuries. The flood of information was overwhelming, a physical assault. A strangled gasp escaped Lena's lips. Her knees buckled, her own strength failing under the weight of his ancient agony. Cassian ripped his hand away as if he'd been scorched, a guttural snarl tearing from his throat. He stumbled back, his eyes wide with a new kind of shock. He hadn't felt her presence in his mind. His mental shields were too strong for that. But he had felt the bond. He had felt the raw, unfiltered surge of her shock, her agony mirroring his own. For that split second, their souls had touched, and he had felt his own pain reflected back at him through her. He stared at her, breathing heavily. The fury in his eyes replaced by a dawning, horrified confusion. She wasn't looking at him with defiance anymore. She was looking at him with something that stripped away all his defenses, that laid his soul bare. She was looking at him with understanding. What did you do?" he demanded, his voice rough, unsteady. Lena couldn't speak. She could only stare back, her heart shattering for this monster, this tyrant, this lonely, desperate king. The truth was so much worse than she could have ever imagined. The war, the hatred, the political maneuvering. It was all a distraction, a grand, bloody piece of theater to hide the fact that his kingdom was rotting from within. Her mission was a lie. Her hatred was a phantom. The only real thing in this room was the unbearable truth and the searing, undeniable bond that had forced her to see it. The dagger hidden in her boot felt less like a weapon, and more like a cruel joke. To kill him now would not be an act of war. It would be a mercy killing. And to what end? To leave his dying people leaderless, exposed to the world? Cassian watched her, his powerful mind racing, trying to comprehend what had just happened. He saw the shift in her, the way her alpha defiance had crumbled, replaced by a raw, staggering pity, and it terrified him more than her hatred ever could. Without another word, he turned and fled the room. He didn't stride. He fled. The heavy door slammed shut behind him, but this time, Lena did not hear the lock. An oversight born of panic? Or a test? It didn't matter. She sank to the cold obsidian floor, her body trembling, her mind reeling from the stolen echoes of his pain. She was trapped. Not by the locked door or the silver bars, but by a truth so devastating it had shattered her world. She, Lena of the Silverfang, had come to kill a tyrant. But the tyrant did not exist. In his place stood a man carrying the weight of a dying world, a man who was, against all reason and all hope, her fated mate. And she had just looked directly into his soul. Chapter 5. The silence Cassian left in his wake was heavier than any lock. It was a silence filled with the ghosts of his stolen memories, with the screams of his dying people. Lena remained on the cold floor, the profound chill of the obsidian seeping into her bones, a poor imitation of the soul-deep cold she'd felt from him. The tyrant was a facade, his cruelty a shield, his kingdom a beautiful, dying masterpiece, and he had left the door unlocked. Her first instinct, the primal urge of her wolf, was to run. The path to freedom was clear. The unlocked door was a glaring oversight, a mistake born of his panic and exposure. She could be gone before anyone noticed, melt into the jagged mountains that surrounded the citadel, and find her way back to the world of green forests and silver moonlight. She could return to her pack, to her father, and warn them. Not of a tyrant's ambition, but of a dying race's desperation. But as she rose to her feet, her body aching with a pain that wasn't hers, a different instinct took over. The cold, calculating mind of the alpha. An unlocked door from a king who overlooked nothing was not a mistake. It was a test. Or a trap. He had felt her shock, her empathy, resonate back through the bond. He had seen the truth dawn in her eyes. Now he was watching from the shadows, waiting to see what the wolf would do with his most devastating secret. Would she run and expose him to the world? Would she use it as a weapon against him? Lena walked to the massive door, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She placed a hand on the cold, petrified wood. It was real, unlatched, a gateway to freedom or a deeper level of hell. Her wolf screamed run. Her training as a warrior urged escape. But the bond wept. It was a low, mournful hum in her soul, a call to her other half who was, at this very moment, drowning in an abyss of lonely agony. To run now would be to abandon him, to leave him to face his dying world utterly alone, just as he had for centuries. And the alpha within her, the leader who knew the crushing weight of responsibility, whispered a single, dangerous word. Stay. Running was the coward's path. She had been sent here to end a threat, and the threat had just revealed itself to be a tragedy of epic proportions. Her mission hadn't ended. It had transformed. With a deep, steadying breath, Lena pulled the heavy door open. The two guards who had been posted there snapped to attention, their eternally still forms jolting with surprise. Their obsidian eyes widened as they saw her standing in the open doorway, not a prisoner, but a queen surveying her domain. They gripped the hilts of their swords, their bodies tensing for a confrontation, but they did not move to stop her. They were paralyzed by uncertainty. Their king had locked her in. Now she was out. They had no orders for this. Lena met their gaze, her silver-gray eyes calm and unwavering. She offered them a slow, deliberate nod, a gesture of an alpha acknowledging her pack. And then she turned, walking down the silent, torchlit corridor. She did not run. She walked with purpose, her every step echoing in the cavernous hall, a declaration that she was not a fugitive, but a force to be reckoned with. The Citadel, once a labyrinthine prison, now felt different. It was still a place of shadows and secrets, but now she held the key to its darkest one. She followed the pull of the bond, the invisible thread that tugged at her soul, leading her deeper into the heart of the royal wing. It led her past chambers sealed with heavy doors, and down a winding staircase to a level of the Citadel she had not yet seen. The scent of old parchment, beeswax, and his unique, storm-like presence grew stronger. She came to a halt before a set of more modest, yet equally ancient doors, carved with symbols of knowledge and lineage. This was his sanctuary, his private study. She pushed the door open without knocking. The room was a stark contrast to the cold opulence of the bedchamber. It was a space of contained chaos, a scholar's den, and a warrior's command center. Bookshelves soared into the darkness, crammed with ancient, leather-bound tomes. Maps of the known world, marked with strategic notations, were spread across a massive oak table, and in the center of it all, standing before a hearth where a low fire crackled, was Cassian. He did not seem surprised to see her. He stood with a glass of deep red liquid, blood, she knew, in his hand, staring into the flames. The firelight danced across the sharp planes of his face, highlighting the profound weariness in his golden eyes. He looked less like a king and more like a ghost, haunted by the very stones of his castle. "I expected you to be halfway to the Silverfang territories by now," he said, his voice flat, devoid of the earlier rage. He didn't turn to look at her. "And prove your counsel right? That I am nothing but a feral beast who bolts at the first opportunity?" Lena closed the door behind her, the soft click sealing them in. "You underestimate me." He finally turned, his gaze sweeping over her, assessing, questioning. The bond flared, a low, steady hum of recognition now, not the violent surge of before. "Then you are a fool. I gave you your freedom. You should have taken it. It wasn't freedom you offered. It was a test," she countered, walking slowly towards the fire, towards him. "You wanted to see what I would do with your secret." The Withering. The name, spoken aloud in his private sanctum, made him flinch. The glass in his hand trembled, a single drop of crimson spilling like a tear onto the stone floor. He placed the glass down with a heavy, final sound. "You have no idea what you are speaking of," he bit out, his defenses snapping back into place. "You gleaned a name from a terrified servant's mind. You understand nothing." "I understand enough," Lena pressed, stopping a few feet from him, the warmth of the fire a welcome contrast to the chill between them. "I understand your tyranny is a performance to hide your people's weakness from your enemies. I understand the blood tithes are not for power, but for research. I understand that every time one of your nobles succumbs to the shriek, a piece of your own soul dies with them." She took a breath, her voice softening, laced with the pain she had felt from him. "And I understand the crushing loneliness of being the only one strong enough to carry the burden." Every word was a hammer blow, systematically dismantling the wall he had spent centuries building. His face, once a perfect mask of immortal control, began to crumble. The muscles in his jaw worked. His hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. He looked away from her, back to the fire, his proud shoulders slumping with a weariness that was truly ancient. "Why?" he finally whispered, his voice raw, broken. "Why did you stay?" Because my wolf runs from danger, Lena answered, her voice resonating with a truth she was only just beginning to understand herself. But my alpha stays for her pack. And the bond? It tells me you are my pack now, Cassian. Whether you accept it or not. He let out a harsh, ragged breath that was halfway to a sob. Pack? He turned back to her, and his golden eyes were no longer cold, but filled with a profound, shimmering agony. You would bind yourself to this? To a kingdom of the dying? To a king whose bloodline is cursed? He took a step towards her, his voice dropping to a desperate, ragged whisper. I rejected you, Lena. I was cruel to you. Not because I do not feel the bond. I feel it like a fire in my veins, a brand on my very soul, but because I feel it. He was in front of her now, his immense sorrow a tangible force, drawing the very air from her lungs. From the moment our blood touched, I knew. I knew you were my mate, my one chance at ending this insufferable solitude, he confessed, his voice breaking. And in that same moment I knew I had to cast you out. To bind you to me, to my lineage, is to curse you. It is to sentence you to watch our people wither and turn to dust, to one day watch me wither. It is a cruelty I would not inflict upon my greatest enemy, let alone the other half of my soul. The truth of his words, the sheer, selfless agony behind his rejection, shattered the last of Lena's defenses. This wasn't hatred. It was a twisted, heartbreaking act of protection. He had tried to save her from himself, from his own cursed existence. Tears she hadn't even realized she was holding back welled in her eyes. The urge to touch him, to offer some small comfort in the face of his monumental pain, was overwhelming. Slowly she lifted her hand. He watched the movement, his body tense, expecting a blow, a rejection of his own. But she did not strike him. She gently, tentatively, placed her palm against his cheek. His skin was as cold as marble, but beneath it, the bond erupted in a silent symphony of relief. A tidal wave of shared sensation. A shudder racked his body, and his golden eyes, filled with centuries of unshed tears, fluttered shut. He leaned into her touch, a king surrendering not to a foe, but to the first glimmer of warmth he had felt in an age. You have carried this alone for far too long, Lena whispered, her thumb brushing against his sharp cheekbone. You don't have to anymore. Chapter 6. The world narrowed to the space of a single touch. Lena's palm against Cassian's cheek was an anchor in a sea of ancient pain, a point of impossible warmth against his marble-cold skin. For a long, suspended moment, he did not move, did not breathe. He simply existed in that touch, a king unburdened, a man allowed a flicker of solace. The mate bond, a torrent of agony just moments before, gentled into a deep, flowing river of shared sensation. Through it, she felt the rigid walls of his self-control dissolving, felt the gratitude, the relief, the sheer, staggering weight of his surrender. A low sound, a ragged sigh that was almost a groan, escaped his lips. His own hand, large and impossibly strong, rose to cover hers, pressing her palm more firmly against his face as if he feared she might vanish. The simple, possessive gesture sent a jolt of protective fire through Lena. This was her mate. Not the tyrant, not the king, but the core of the man beneath the crown, and he was breaking. You cannot save me, Lena, he murmured, his voice a raw whisper against her skin, his golden eyes still closed. This curse is in our blood. It is the price of our immortality. A slow, inevitable decay of the soul. Lena's alpha nature, the part of her that led hunts and defended territories, recoiled from the word inevitable. Nothing is inevitable, she stated, her voice regaining its strength, its command. She would not let him drown in this despair. Every sickness has a cure. Every curse has a counter. You have fought this alone for too long. relying on vampire lore, on blood magic. She gently pulled her hand away, forcing him to open his eyes and meet her gaze. The loss of contact was a physical wrench for both of them, but it was necessary. She was not here to be his comfort. She was here to be his equal. "You need a new perspective," she continued, her silver-gray eyes alight with a fire he had not seen before. Not defiance, but purpose. "My people. The shamans of the northern packs. They understand the balance of life and spirit in ways your alchemists never could. They speak to the earth, to the moon. They know of blights that rot the soul. Let me help you, Cassian. Let me send for them." He stared at her as if she'd spoken in a dead language. The hope that had flickered in his eyes was extinguished, replaced by a harsh, weary reality. He straightened up, the kingly mask of cold authority slowly reassembling itself. "You would invite a pack of wolf shamans into the heart of my citadel?" he asked, his tone laced with a bitter, incredulous irony. "To what end?" "So they can witness our decay firsthand, and report back to your father that the great vampire kingdom is ready to be picked clean like a carcass?" He turned away, pacing back towards the massive desk. "The risk is too great. Secrecy is our only shield. It is the only reason we still exist." "Secrecy is a slow death," Lena countered, her frustration rising. "It is a tomb you are building around your people, stone by stone. What is the point of your shield if everyone behind it is already dead?" "It is my burden to bear, not yours," he roared, whirling back to face her, the barely contained violence returning to his frame. The brief moment of vulnerability was gone, slammed shut behind a wall of pride and fear. "You have been here one day. You cannot possibly comprehend the centuries of delicate, bloody politics that keep our enemies at bay. And you cannot see the potential ally standing right in front of you," she shot back, her voice ringing with the authority of an alpha. "I am not just your mate, Cassian. I am the daughter of the Alpha King of the Silverfang. A union between us, a real one, could be more than a fragile truce. It could be the foundation of an empire that could weather any storm, even this one." The sheer audacity of her words silenced him. He looked at her, truly looked at her, not as a curse or a weakness, but as the warrior she was. He saw the fire in her eyes, the unyielding strength in her stance. He saw a queen. And the sight, the possibility, was both intoxicating and terrifying. Before he could form a reply, a sharp, urgent rap echoed from the heavy oak door. "Your Majesty! Lord Vorlag demands an audience! He will not be turned away!" A guard's muffled voice called from the corridor. Cassian's entire demeanor shifted. The conflict in his eyes was shuttered, replaced by the cold, absolute command of the Blood King. The change was so swift, so complete. It was chilling. He was once again the tyrant, the unassailable monarch. "I will deal with this," he said to Lena, his voice low and hard. "Return to your chambers. Do not leave them again. We will speak of this later." "No," Lena said, planting her feet. The time for hiding, for being his prisoner, was over. "I will not hide. He is calling for my head. Let him do it to my face. Let your council see that I am not afraid of them." A flicker of something, admiration perhaps, or exasperation, crossed Cassian's face. "You will get yourself killed." "Only if my king allows it," she retorted, a direct challenge. A tense moment stretched between them, a silent battle of wills. Cassian's jaw was a hard, uncompromising line. He was a king accustomed to absolute obedience, and she was defying him at every turn. But her defiance was not that of a rebellious child. It was the stand of an equal. With a sharp, frustrated exhalation, he relented. "Stay behind me, and do not speak unless I command it." He strode to the door and pulled it open. Lord Vorlag stood in the corridor, his ancient aristocratic face contorted with a mixture of grief and righteous fury. He was flanked by 2 other council members, their expressions equally grim. Vorlag's eyes, the color of faded parchment, immediately found Lena standing by the fire, and his face hardened further. "Your Majesty," Vorlag began, his voice shaking with suppressed rage as he bowed stiffly. "I see the beast is off her leash. I came to tell you the council has reached a verdict. By the ancient laws, the wolf's chaotic magic has defiled our sacred rites. She is a clear and present danger to the stability of the kingdom. She must be executed before sunrise." The finality of his words sent a chill down Lena's spine, but she did not flinch. She met the old vampire's hateful glare with a calm, steady gaze of her own. Cassian remained in the doorway, a formidable, unmoving pillar of shadow. "The council has reached a verdict," he repeated, his voice dangerously soft. "But they seem to have forgotten who it is that passes judgment in this kingdom." "The laws are clear, sire," one of the other council members insisted. "They supersede even the crown when the spiritual health of our people is at stake." "The spiritual health of my people is my only concern," Cassian countered, his golden eyes sweeping over the 3 of them, a silent promise of violence in their depths. "Which is why I will not be executing my queen." The word dropped into the silence like a block of obsidian, stunning the 3 council members into speechlessness. Even Lena's breath caught in her throat. Queen, he had called her his queen, in front of his council. It was not a term of endearment, it was a political declaration, a shield, a claim. Vorlage was the first to recover, his face turning a sickly pale gray. "Queen? Sire, she is a wolf, a savage. She probed my servant's mind. She is an enemy spy." "She is my fated mate," Cassian's voice boomed, resonating with a power that made the very torches in the corridor flicker. "An anomaly the likes of which none of us have ever seen. The power you all felt at the ceremony was not a curse. It was the birth of a new lineage, a new strength." He was spinning a narrative, a lie built around a kernel of truth, and he was doing it with such absolute conviction that even Lena almost believed him. "You saw what happened," he continued, his voice dropping, becoming almost conspiratorial, drawing them in. "You felt that power. A power that could perhaps burn away the shadows that have plagued our bloodlines for so long." He left the implication hanging, a masterful, dangerous hint at a cure, using the very event they feared as a beacon of hope. The council members exchanged uncertain glances. The seed of doubt had been planted. Their fear of Lena was now at war with their desperate hope for salvation from the Withering. "She will remain by my side," Cassian declared, his decision absolute. "She is under my personal protection. Her status is no longer a matter for council debate. It is a matter of royal decree." He stepped aside, his gesture a clear invitation for them to look at Lena again. "Behold the Blood Queen of the Obsidian Citadel, and know that any threat to her is a direct act of treason against the crown." Vorlage stared, his mouth agape, his rage momentarily eclipsed by shock. He looked from his unyielding king to the silver-eyed wolf who now stood by the royal hearth as if she owned it. He saw not a cowering prisoner but an alpha, her chin high, her power a quiet, confident aura around her. He had lost, for now. With a bow that was almost a snarl, Vorlag retreated, his fellow council members following in his wake like shadows. Cassian closed the door, the heavy oak muffling their furious, retreating whispers. He leaned his forehead against the cool wood, the immense effort of the confrontation leaving him drained. The bond, which had pulsed with his power and authority, now thrummed with a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. "Blood Queen?" Lena asked softly from across the room. He turned, a wry, humorless smile touching his lips. I trust the title is to your liking, he said, his voice laced with dark irony. It seems I have just declared war on my own counsel to save my assassin's life. You are proving to be a remarkably inconvenient mate, Lena of the Silverfang. You have also just given me a crown, she replied, taking a step towards him, and a queen protects her kingdom. And her king. The dynamic between them had irrevocably shifted. She was no longer a prisoner. He was no longer just her target. They were allies, bound by a shared secret, a shared enemy, and a fate that was determined to destroy them both. Chapter 7. The hollow echo of the council members' retreat faded, leaving a brittle silence in its place. Cassian remained leaning against the door, the mantle of the unyielding Blood King seeming to weigh on him like a physical shroud. Lena watched as the immense, projected power receded from him, leaving behind the frayed edges of the exhausted man she had seen moments before. He had thrown down a gauntlet, declared her his queen, and in doing so, had drawn a battle line directly through the heart of his own court. He had saved her life, but he had also painted a target on her back so large it could be seen from the moon she once worshipped. That was a dangerous move, Lena said, her voice quiet in the sudden stillness of the study. Declaring me your queen. You've given your counsel a single throat to choke. Cassian pushed himself away from the door, moving back toward the decanter of blood on his desk. He poured another glass, his hand steady despite the tremors of exhaustion she could feel through their bond. It was the only move, he replied, his back to her. Vorlag and the others feed on fear. To show hesitation, to allow them to see you as a prisoner to be debated, would have been your death sentence. He turned, his golden eyes meeting hers over the rim of the glass. Now they see you as an extension of my power. They will still hate you. They will still conspire against you. But they will have to do so in the shadows. And I see best in the shadows. So I have traded a gilded cage for a crown of thorns, she mused. Still a prisoner, just one with a title. You are not a prisoner, he countered, a spark of his earlier frustration returning. You are a strategic asset. Your life is now intrinsically tied to the stability of my reign, a fact I find deeply unsettling. The fragile truce held, a thin sheet of ice over a raging sea. He had defended her, claimed her, but the chasm of their ingrained mistrust remained. He had shared his secret out of necessity, not out of a desire for partnership. As he spoke, a tremor racked his frame, so subtle she would have missed it if not for the bond that amplified his every sensation. The glass in his hand rattled against the desk as he set it down, and he gripped the edge of the heavy oak, his knuckles turning white. The weight of centuries, of his secret war, was finally bending him. Lena moved before she could think, her body acting on an instinct deeper than thought, deeper than her training. In 2 swift, silent strides, she was at his side, her hand hovering just above his arm, unsure of her right to touch him now that the raw confession was over. Cassian? He did not look at her, his head bowed, his breath coming in a harsh, ragged rhythm. It is nothing. The power I expended, it requires a toll. Liar, she whispered, the word laced not with accusation, but with a pained understanding. This was the Withering's touch, the constant drain of his fight against it. Without another thought, she closed the final inch of distance and laid her hand on his arm. The connection was like a lightning strike of pure, unadulterated life. It was not a probe of his mind, but a raw transfer of vitality. A torrent of her vibrant, wolf-born energy, wild, warm, and intrinsically tied to the living world, poured from her into him through the conduit of the mate bond. The cold of his skin seemed to leach the warmth from her, but in its place, A powerful, resonant hum filled the space between them, a symphony of their shared existence. Cassian gasped, his head snapping up, his golden eyes wide with shock and something akin to wonder. The deep lines of exhaustion on his face softened. The violent tremor in his body stilled. He stared at her hand on his arm, then at her face, as if seeing her for the first time. The raw, life-giving energy she possessed was anathema to his cursed, decaying immortality, and yet the bond was turning it into a balm. "How?" he breathed, his voice filled with awe. "I am an alpha," Lena said simply. "My strength is not just my own. It is the strength of my pack, of the earth, of the moon. And you," she added, her voice dropping, "are now my pack." He pulled his arm away, not with the revulsion of before, but with the cautious movement of a man touching fire for the first time. The loss of contact left an echoing void between them. "Your life force, it is a weapon I cannot afford to wield," he said, his voice strained. "To become dependent on you would make me vulnerable in ways I cannot even fathom." "To refuse the aid of your mate is a fool's pride," she shot back, stepping away to give him space, her own heart racing from the intensity of the exchange. "You cannot win this war with pride, Cassian. You win it with every weapon at your disposal. And like it or not, I am now the most powerful weapon in your arsenal." Her words hung in the air, a declaration that redefined their alliance. She would not be a passive queen, a protected asset. She would be a warrior at his side. "I will not sit in a locked room and wait for your enemies to wither, or for mine to come for my throat," she continued, her voice ringing with command. "I want to see your research, all of it. The ancient texts, the alchemical notes, every failed ritual. I want to see the heart of this sickness." He stared at her, a long, silent battle raging in his golden eyes. To grant her request was to give her access to the deepest, most protected secrets of his kingdom. It was an act of trust that went against every instinct he had honed over 1,000 years of solitary rule. But to refuse was to reject the only new variable, the only glimmer of hope that had appeared in centuries. "The royal library is sealed," he finally said, his voice low. "Its knowledge is not for the eyes of outsiders." "I am not an outsider," Lena countered, her gaze unwavering. "You yourself just named me queen. Your queen requires access, your majesty." The corner of his mouth twitched, the barest hint of a grim smile. "You are relentless." "I am an alpha," she repeated. "We do not know how to be otherwise." With a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of his entire lineage, he nodded once. "Very well, I will grant you access, but you will be accompanied by my royal scholar, Tyrant. He is the keeper of the archives. And Lena," he added, his voice turning deadly serious, "he will report your every move to me. Do not think for a moment that my trust is easily won." "I don't expect it to be," she said. "I expect to earn it." Later, returning to the opulent bedchamber felt different. The cage had changed shape. The bars were no longer made of silver and stone, but of political intrigue and fragile, unspoken pacts. She had won a victory, a small foothold in his secret war, but she felt no triumph. Only the heavy weight of what was to come. As she entered, she saw a figure standing by the cold hearth. It was the young servant girl, Ilara, her hands clasped before her, her head bowed. The girl flinched as Lena entered, her body trembling with a fear that was now achingly familiar. Lena's instincts screamed. This was not a coincidence. This was a message, a test. Vorlag, denied his execution, had sent the bait back into the den to see if the beast would show its teeth. Lena closed the door softly behind her. "Ilara," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "You may look at me." The girl slowly lifted her head, her eyes wide, dark pools of terror. She expected a blow, an accusation, a curse. Instead, Lena walked past her and knelt before the hearth, striking a flint to the kindling that had been left there. "It is cold in here," Lena said, not looking at the girl, her movements calm and methodical. "No one should have to stand in the cold." The simple act of kindness seemed to confuse Alara more than any threat could have. She stood frozen, watching as the flames caught, casting a warm, dancing light across the obsidian floor. "Why were you sent here?" Lena asked, still focused on the fire. To attend you, Your Majesty," the girl stammered, the words clearly rehearsed. "And what did Lord Vorlag instruct you to do?" Lena pressed, her voice still soft, but with an underlying edge of steel. Alara's breath hitched, a tiny, terrified sound. He said only to serve you well." Lena finally rose and turned to face the girl. She saw the lie in her eyes, the desperate fear of a pawn in a game she did not understand. Lena could have touched her, could have ripped the truth from her mind and confirmed Vorlag's treachery. But that is what he was expecting. He was watching, through this child's eyes or through others, waiting for the wolf to behave as predicted. Instead, Lena walked to the table where a platter of fruit had been left. She picked up a blood-red pomegranate, its skin gleaming in the firelight. "I have no need of a servant," Lena said, holding the fruit out to the girl. "But you look like you have not eaten. Take this." Alara stared at the offering, then at Lena's face, her own expression a mask of confusion. "Go on," Lena urged. "No one in this room will harm you." Trembling, Alara reached out and took the fruit, her cold fingers brushing against Lena's. It was all the contact Lena needed. Not a probe, but an open channel. And through it, she felt not the girl's chaotic fear, but a sharp, cold shard of intent that was not her own. Vorlag's voice, a memory in the girl's mind, echoed clear as a bell. "Report her every move, every word, see if the beast shows its teeth. The king may protect her for now, but the council will not tolerate a monster wearing our crown." Lena released the girl's hand, her expression unreadable. She had her confirmation. The game had begun. "Go," Lena said, her voice regaining its full alpha command. "Tell your master that the Blood Queen is not cold, and she is not hungry." She held Alara's terrified gaze. "But she is always watching." The girl clutched the pomegranate and fled, her relief palpable. Lena stood alone in the firelight, the warmth doing little to chase away the chill of her new reality. The unlocked door had not led to freedom. It had led to a far more dangerous battlefield. And Lena of the Silverfang had always been a master of the hunt. Chapter 8. The Royal Library of the Obsidian Citadel was not a place of quiet scholarship. It was a tomb of forgotten knowledge. Lena felt it the moment the towering bronze doors groaned open. The air was thick with the scent of decaying parchment, dried ink, and the profound, suffocating dust of ages. It was the smell of stagnation, of a people who had stopped looking forward and had instead become consumed by their past. Sunlight had never touched these halls. The only illumination came from enchanted crystals embedded in the ceiling, casting a cold, blue-white glow that leached the color from everything, rendering the endless rows of bookshelves as monolithic and imposing as a graveyard. Waiting for her just inside the doors was a vampire so ancient he seemed almost translucent. He was hunched, his spine curved like a question mark, his skin stretched thin as parchment over a delicate bone structure. But his eyes, behind thick crystal lenses, were shockingly sharp and intelligent, the color of faded ink. This was Tyrant, the royal scholar. "Your Majesty," he intoned, the title dripping with a skepticism so profound it was almost an insult. His bow was shallow, a perfunctory gesture of a man whose true loyalty was to the knowledge he guarded, not to the wolf who had come to defile it. Lena ignored the slight. She had dealt with resentful old wolves her entire life. A vampire was no different. "Theron," she acknowledged, her voice echoing in the cathedral-like silence. "The king has granted me access." "So he has," Theron replied, his thin lips barely moving. "A most unconventional decision?" He turned, his dark robes sweeping the dusty floor. "The archives are vast. It would take one of your short, mortal lifetimes merely to learn the cataloging system. Where did you wish to begin your browsing?" The condescension was a goad, and Lena refused to take the bait. "I am not here to browse," she said, her gaze sweeping the towering shelves, a strategist assessing a battlefield. "I am here to hunt. I need everything you have on spiritual decay, blood curses, and plagues of the soul." Theron stopped, his head tilting. Such specific interests for a barbarian, he mused, more to himself than to her. "The king's research has focused on the alchemy of blood, on lineage and regeneration. The topics you name are esoteric, unreliable. His methods have failed for centuries," Lena stated bluntly. "A new approach is required." A flicker of something, annoyance, perhaps even pain, crossed the scholar's ancient face. To him, her words were a blasphemy against his king's desperate, unending work. "As you wish," he said stiffly. "Follow me." The section on pre-covenant maledictions is in the lower west wing. Try not to touch anything unnecessarily. The oils on your skin are corrosive to ancient vellum. Lena followed him through the labyrinth of shelves, the silence broken only by the whisper of his robes and the soft pad of her boots. The sheer volume of knowledge was overwhelming, a testament to a civilization that had hoarded the wisdom of millennia. Yet it was all for naught. They had all the answers in the world, but they hadn't been asking the right questions. For hours, Lena worked. Theron deposited her in a dusty alcove, surrounded by towering stacks of scrolls and leather-bound tomes whose very spines seemed to groan with age. True to his word, he watched her, a silent, judgmental specter from a nearby desk, his quill scratching occasionally as he made his notes for the king. Lena's approach was, as she had known it would be, different. She did not pore over every word. She let her instincts guide her, her alpha senses sifting through the texts. She ran her fingers over titles written in dead languages, letting the faint vibrations of the magic within them speak to her. She was searching for a scent, a trace, a connection to the living world that these creatures of the night had long forgotten. The bond with Cassian was a low, constant hum beneath the surface of her thoughts. She could feel him, elsewhere in the citadel, locked in a tense meeting with his council. She felt the waves of their hostility, their fear, and the unyielding iron wall of his will pushing back against them. The sensation was a strange comfort and a powerful motivator. He was fighting his war. She would fight hers. Most of the texts were useless, filled with vampiric arrogance, tales of their own power, their own eternity, dismissing all other forms of magic as primitive. But then she found it. Tucked away in a collection of histories from civilizations that had crumbled long before the first vampire rose, was a small, unassuming book bound in what looked like petrified wood. It had no title. As her fingers brushed the cover, a jolt went through her. It was not a vision, but a feeling, a deep, resonant echo of profound despair, the same soul-deep weariness she felt from Cassian. Her breath caught. This was it. She pulled the book from the shelf, a small cloud of dust blooming in the cold air. She carefully opened the brittle pages. The script was archaic, a pictographic language she did not recognize. But the illustrations, they were horrifyingly familiar. They depicted humanoid figures, tall and graceful, their bodies slowly turning gray, their eyes fading. The final illustration was of a figure with its mouth open in a silent, agonized scream, its very essence seeming to tear apart. The shriek. "What have you found?" Theron's dry voice startled her. He had moved from his desk, his curiosity finally overriding his disdain. He peered over her shoulder at the open page. His ancient eyes widened behind his lenses. The Ethel. Impossible. This text was thought lost. "You know of them?" Lena asked, her heart beginning to pound. "A legend. A cautionary tale," Theron breathed, his scholarly excitement palpable. "They were a race of celestial beings, said to be the architects of the very mountains we stand on. They were immortal, powerful, until they weren't. The legends say they were struck by a blight, a fading that consumed their spirits and left them as husks. No one ever knew the cause, or the cure." He reached out a trembling, skeletal finger to trace one of the pictograms. As he leaned closer, his sleeve brushed against her arm. The contact was fleeting, but it was enough. She was not prepared for the depth of what she received. It was not just his academic interest, but a lifetime of fierce paternal love and fear for Cassian. He saw Cassian as a fledgling, a serious, lonely child burdened by a crown far too soon. He saw himself teaching the young king, guiding him, watching him grow into the formidable, isolated monarch he was today. And he saw his own terrifying future. The fear that one day he, Theron, would begin to feel the cold of the withering in his own veins. That he would forget the face of the boy he had raised as a son. The depth of his loyalty, his hidden love for his king, was a staggering revelation. Theron was not just a servant. He was family. The only family Cassian had left. Lena pulled her arm back, her own eyes stinging with unshed tears for this lonely old man and his lonely king. Theron, lost in the discovery, didn't seem to notice. The pictograms... Lena forced herself to focus, her voice slightly hoarse. They seemed to tell a story. "Look," she pointed to a sequence, a falling star, the Ethel drinking from a river touched by the star's light. Then the first signs of the fading. It wasn't a curse from an enemy. It was something they consumed, something that poisoned their immortality. Theron followed her finger, his mind, sharpened by millennia of scholarship, moving with incredible speed. The Starfall River, according to the ancient maps, it once flowed where the Citadel's deepest wellsprings now draw their water. The very water that sustains the heart of our kingdom. The implication was a physical blow. The source of their power, their immortality, was also the source of their curse. They were drinking poison. "But there's more," Lena whispered, her eyes scanning the final pages. The script changed, became more frantic, more desperate. The last illustrations were of a ritual. A figure with silver hair and a figure with golden eyes, their hands clasped. A wolf and a sun. A union of night and day, of earth and sky. "What is that?" Theron breathed, leaning so close she could feel the faint, dusty chill of his breath. "I don't know the words," Lena said, tracing the final pictogram. It was a single, perfect flower, blooming from a cracked and barren stone, bathed in the light of both a full moon and a midday sun. But it looks like a union, a balance. They believed the cure was not in removing the poison, but in counteracting it, in finding an opposite force to restore what was lost. She looked up from the book, her silver-gray eyes meeting the scholar's ink-dark ones. The unspoken truth hung between them, as clear and sharp as a shard of ice. A union of opposites. A wolf and a vampire. A child of the moon and a child of the night. Her and Cassian. Theron stared at her, his ancient, skeptical mind finally, irrevocably broken open. He saw not a barbarian, not a beast, but the other half of an equation he had spent centuries trying to solve. He saw hope. "My king," Theron whispered, his voice trembling with the weight of his discovery. "He must be told." At that exact moment, a surge of pure, unadulterated fury ripped through the mate bond, so violent and powerful it made Lena cry out and stagger back. Cassian. His rage was a physical force, a tidal wave of ice and fire that promised death. He wasn't in a meeting anymore. He was on the hunt. And something had gone terribly, horribly wrong. Chapter 9. The rage that slammed through the bond was a physical entity. It was not the controlled fury Cassian had shown his council, but a raw, unmaking chaos, the sound of a star collapsing into a black hole of pure, murderous intent. Lena cried out, her hands flying to her chest as if to physically hold herself together against the psychic onslaught. The ancient book slipped from her grasp, thudding onto the dusty stone floor, its message of hope momentarily forgotten in the face of imminent violence. "Your Majesty!" Theron gasped, his ancient face paling, his scholarly calm shattered. He saw the raw pain on her face, the way she trembled. "What is it?" "What do you feel?" "Cassian?" she breathed, the name a pained whisper. "He's lost control. He's going to kill someone." The bond was no longer a hum or a pull. It was a shriek of pure, undiluted bloodlust. It was the predator unleashed, the ancient beast beneath the kingly facade finally bared. And it was calling to her wolf. Not with a plea for comfort, but with a howl for a partner in the slaughter. The primal, savage part of her wanted to answer that call, to run to his side and help him tear his enemies apart. But the alpha in her, the queen he had named her, knew this was his unmaking. A king who butchers his own council is no longer a king. He is a rabid dog, and his kingdom will tear itself apart to put him down. "Where?" Theron demanded, his loyalty to his king overriding his fear. "Where is he?" Lena didn't need a map. The bond was a screaming beacon, a path of psychic devastation pulling her through the citadel. "The throne room," she said, her silver eyes hardening with grim purpose. "Vorlag! He's done something!" Without another word, she turned and ran. She flew through the labyrinthine library, her boots echoing in the oppressive silence. Theron, surprisingly agile for his age, was close behind her, his dark robes flying. The bronze doors, which had seemed so impossibly heavy before, swung open before her, as if sensing her urgency. The citadel guards in the corridors saw her coming, a silver-eyed whirlwind of fierce determination, and they instinctively stepped aside. They saw not a prisoner, but their new queen moving with the authority of a storm. As she neared the throne room, the air grew frigid. A palpable aura of death and absolute power radiated from behind the massive doors, so intense it felt like a physical pressure against her skin. The 2 Praetorian guards stationed there were frozen in place, their hands on their swords, their immortal faces etched with a terror she hadn't thought them capable of. She didn't slow down. "Open them!" she commanded, her voice ringing with an alpha's power that cut through their fear-induced paralysis. One of the guards, his eyes wide, obeyed. The great obsidian doors groaned open, revealing a scene of frozen, horrifying chaos. The throne room was a battlefield. Several members of the royal guard lay scattered, not dead, but incapacitated. Their black armor cracked and dented as if by an invisible, explosive force. Lord Vorlag was on his knees in the center of the room, his fine robes torn, a thin trickle of blood running from his lips. Behind him, cowering and weeping, was the servant girl, Ilara, and standing over them, his back to the throne, was Cassian. He was transformed. A visible corona of black and gold energy, raw and untamed, pulsed around him. His fangs were fully extended, his perfect face a mask of inhuman fury. His golden eyes were no longer the eyes of a king. They were the soulless, burning novas of a god of death. He held a long, thin blade of pure obsidian, its tip leveled at Vorlag's throat. The rest of the council stood frozen along the walls, their faces a mixture of terror and grim satisfaction. They had pushed their king, goaded him, and now they were witnessing the monster they had always feared was lurking beneath the crown. "You dare!" Cassian's voice was a low, guttural rumble, a sound that came from the very depths of the earth. "To use a child as your weapon. You dare to lay a trap for my queen in my own citadel. For your treason, Vorlag, your line does not just end. It will be erased from history." Vorlag, to his credit, lifted his chin, his pride warring with his terror. "She is a beast!" "I did what I had to do to prove it, to protect us." "You proved only the depths of your own cowardice," Cassian snarled, raising the blade. "No!" Lena's voice cut through the charged air like a whip. Every head snapped towards her. Cassian froze, the obsidian blade humming a hair's breadth from Vorlag's throat. His head turned slowly, and his burning, inhuman eyes fixed on her. The raw, killing intent he directed at her was so powerful she felt her knees weaken, her wolf whimpering in the face of its enraged mate. But she stood her ground. "Get out!" he growled, the words a vibration of pure menace. "This does not concern you?" "Anything that threatens the stability of this kingdom concerns its queen," she retorted, her voice clear and strong despite the frantic hammering of her heart. She began to walk forward, slowly, deliberately, into the heart of the storm. Theron hovered at the doorway, his ancient face pale with dread. "He is a traitor," Cassian stated, his gaze not leaving hers. "Traitors are put to the sword." "He is a fool and a coward," Lena agreed, continuing her slow advance. "And you are a king. Do not let this fool make you a butcher in your own throne room, in front of your entire council. That is what he wants. He wants to unmake you." She could see the war raging within him. The primal beast, unleashed and hungry for blood, was battling with the centuries of control, the king who knew she spoke the truth. The obsidian blade trembled in his hand. "He used a child, Lena." Cassian's voice was laced with a pain that cut through the rage. "He sent that girl, knowing she was terrified, knowing her own mother is in the early stages of the Withering. He used her grief and her fear as a weapon against you, against us." The revelation hit Lena hard. Vorlag hadn't just used a servant. He'd used a grieving, terrified child. A low, feral growl escaped her own lips, her protective instincts flaring, but she forced them down. Rage would solve nothing here. She was now only a few feet away from him, standing between the tip of his blade and the trembling form of Lord Vorlag. She stopped, positioning herself directly in the path of his fury. "Then his crime is heinous," she said, her voice softening, speaking not to the room but only to him. "And his punishment should be just. Banish him, strip him of his titles, let him live out his eternity in disgrace, a living monument to the consequences of treason. Let that be your judgment. A king's judgment. Not this." She gestured to the obsidian blade, to the raw, untamed power bleeding from him. "This is the act of a beast, Cassian. And you are more than that." She held his gaze, pouring every ounce of her will, every ounce of the bond's connection, into her stare. She was his anchor. She had to be. He stared back, his burning eyes searching hers, and for a moment she saw the man beneath the monster, the lonely king drowning in a sea of rage and despair. "He will not stop," Cassian whispered, a confession of his own fear. "He will continue to plot. He will use this against me." "Then we will be ready for him," she whispered back. She took the final, most dangerous step and placed her hand gently on the arm that held the blade. The moment she touched him, the world exploded in a silent, concussive wave. Her life force, Her calm, her unyielding alpha strength poured into him, a river of cool moonlight dousing a raging inferno. The black and gold aura around him flickered violently. He gasped, a harsh, shuddering breath, and the obsidian blade wavered. "Lena," he breathed, her name a plea. "I am here," she said, her voice a steady, unbreakable promise. "Let it go, Cassian. Come back." Slowly, agonizingly, the killing light in his eyes began to recede. The raw, chaotic energy pulled back into him, contained once more. The obsidian blade lowered, inch by painful inch. He was fighting himself, fighting the beast she had called forth, and with her as his anchor, he was winning. Finally, the sword clattered to the obsidian floor, the sound echoing through the stunned silence of the throne room. Cassian stared at his empty hand, then at Vorlag, then at Lena, his chest heaving. The fury was gone, replaced by a profound, chilling exhaustion. He had stood on the precipice of his own damnation, and she had pulled him back. He turned his gaze to his wide-eyed council. His voice, when he spoke, was no longer the guttural roar of a beast, but the cold, absolute command of their king. "Lord Vorlag, for conspiring against the crown and endangering the queen, you are hereby stripped of your titles, your lands, and your seat on this council. You are banished from the citadel. If you are seen within these walls after sunrise, you will be executed on sight. My judgment is final." He then looked at Lena, and in the depths of his golden eyes, she saw a truth that shook her to her core. He saw her not as an asset, not as a mate, but as his salvation, and he was terrified of what that meant. Chapter 10. The silence that fell in the throne room after Vorlag's banishment was a heavy, suffocating thing, thick with the ozone of Cassian's spent rage and the stench of the council's fear. They scurried from the hall like rats fleeing a fire, their ancient, immortal faces pale, their eyes darting nervously between their king and the silver-eyed wolf who stood as his undeniable equal. They left him in the wreckage of his own fury, a king who had just been forced to choose between his law and his soul. Cassian did not move. He stood, a solitary pillar of darkness, staring at the spot where the obsidian blade had fallen. The bond between them was a raw, open nerve, a torrent of chaotic emotions. She felt his bone-deep exhaustion, a weariness so profound it felt like the weight of mountains. Beneath it, a tremor of shame for his loss of control. And deeper still, a terrifying, burgeoning dependency on her. The anchor that had held him back from the abyss. Finally, he turned his head, his golden eyes finding hers. The inhuman fire was gone, leaving them looking like molten gold that had begun to cool. Beautiful, but haunted. "Come," was all he said, his voice a hoarse rasp. He turned and strode from the throne room, not waiting to see if she would follow. He knew she would. The bond, the shared secret, the war he had just declared on their behalf, it all tied them together with chains stronger than any steel. Lena walked behind him, a queen in the shadow of her king. The walk back to his study was an eternity of unspoken words. The bond screamed with them. Gratitude, fear, need, shame, hope. He was a fortress whose walls had been breached, and he had no idea how to rebuild them, or if he even wanted to. Once inside the study, the heavy oak door swinging shut with a sound of finality, he did not face her. He walked to the window, his form a stark silhouette against the cold, gray light of the approaching dawn. He stared out at his kingdom of stone and shadow, his shoulders rigid with a tension that was more than just physical. He was trying to piece himself back together, to reclaim the solitary control that had been his only companion for 1,000 years. "What you saw in there," he began, his voice low, strained. "That was a momentary lapse, a weakness that will not be repeated." Lena's heart ached at his pride, at his desperate attempt to push her away, to diminish the profound connection they had just shared. She would not allow it. "That was not a lapse, Cassian," she said, her voice soft but unyielding as she crossed the room to stand behind him. "That was the abyss. You have been staring into it for centuries, and today you almost fell in." He flinched as if she had struck him. "You know nothing of my burdens." "I know you have carried them alone," she replied. She moved to his desk and retrieved the ancient, untitled book Tyrant had left there in his haste. She carried it to the massive table where his maps were spread and laid it open with a soft, definitive thud. The sound made him turn. "And I know your burdens are killing you. It is time you tried to carry them with me." He stared at the book, at the crude but clear pictograms of the fading Ethel, his eyes narrowing in confusion. "What is this?" "This is hope," Lena said. She pointed to the illustrations, her voice resonating with the conviction of her discovery. Tyrant called them the Ethel, an ancient, immortal race who suffered from a fading that stole their souls. "It looks just like the Withering, doesn't it?" Cassian moved toward the table, his scholar's curiosity momentarily overriding his kingly pride. He leaned over the book, his long, dark hair falling forward, his golden eyes tracing the images with a fierce, desperate intensity. "According to this," Lena continued, "their curse didn't come from an enemy. It came from the very source of their immortality, a starfall river whose waters they drank. Tyrant believes its headwaters are the same as the wellspring that feeds this citadel." The blood drained from Cassian's face, leaving him looking like a marble statue. He traced the pictogram of the falling star, then the figures drinking from the river. The horrifying logic of it settled over him, a truth so simple and so devastating it had been overlooked for millennia. They were poisoning themselves. Every drop of water that sustained their unlife was another step towards the shriek. "All this time," he whispered, his voice cracking with the weight of centuries of fruitless, bloody searching. "All my father's work. My work. We were searching for a cure when we should have been looking for the poison." His hand clenched into a fist on the table. The despair that rolled off him was so potent, Lena felt her own breath catch in sympathy. "But there is more," she said quickly, turning the brittle pages to the final illustrations. "They believed there was a way to fight it. Not a cure, but a balance." She pointed to the pictogram of the wolf and the sun, of the figures with silver hair and golden eyes, their hands clasped. A union of opposites. A power to counteract the poison of a solitary existence. Cassian stared at the final image, the flower blooming from the cracked stone, bathed in the light of both moon and sun. A union. A balance. Him and her. He looked up from the book, his golden eyes meeting hers. The despair was still there. But now, it was mingled with a fragile, terrifying flicker of hope. A hope he hadn't allowed himself to feel in centuries. And it was that hope that finally broke him. "Do you know what you have done?" he asked, his voice a raw, ragged whisper. He pushed away from the table, stalking towards her, his movements unsteady, his perfect control shattered. "For 1,000 years I have been a king of stone and shadow. I have ruled with ice in my veins because it was the only way to keep my people from crumbling into dust. I have felt nothing, allowed myself nothing, because hope is a poison far more potent than any other. It makes you weak. It makes you reckless." He stopped before her, so close she could see the frantic, desperate light in his eyes. "And you," he breathed, his hand rising to hover just inches from her face. "You walk into my life, a creature of fire and moonlight, and you bring with you the most dangerous hope of all." His hand fell, not to her face, but to grip her shoulders, his fingers digging into her flesh not with cruelty, but with a desperate, anchoring need. "When I stood in that throne room, Lena, with that blade in my hand, The beast was free. It wanted blood. It wanted to burn everything to the ground. And then I looked at you. And you. You were the only real thing in the room. You were my anchor. The confession was torn from him, a piece of his very soul laid bare. I am terrified of you, he whispered, his forehead pressing against hers, his eyes squeezing shut. I am terrified of this dependency, of this need. I have never needed anyone. And now I find I cannot exist without you. The raw, unshielded vulnerability of his words shattered the last of Lena's reservations. Her own hands came up to frame his face, her thumbs brushing against his sharp cheekbones. The bond between them surged, a tidal wave of pure, unrestrained emotion, his terror, his need, her fierce protectiveness, her awe. Then don't, she whispered back, her voice thick with unshed tears. Don't exist without me. His eyes opened, and the gold within them was a swirling storm of 1,000 years of loneliness finally coming to an end. Lena, he groaned, her name a prayer and a curse, and then his mouth was on hers. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a collision. It was the desperate, frantic kiss of a drowning man finding air, of a starving man finding sustenance. It was 1,000 years of solitude and despair pouring out of him, and her meeting it with a flood of life and unyielding strength. His arms wrapped around her, crushing her to him as if he could absorb her into himself, bind her to him so she could never leave. She kissed him back with all the ferocity of her alpha soul, her fingers tangling in his dark hair, pulling him closer. This was not a surrender. It was a claiming. She was claiming him, his pain, his burden, his kingdom. And he was letting her, giving her everything he had been too proud and too afraid to offer. He lifted her effortlessly, her legs wrapping around his waist as he carried her from the study, their mouths never parting. He didn't take her to the cold, opulent bedchamber. He took her to his own private rooms, a Spartan soldier's space adjoining the study. He laid her on his bed, the first and only woman to ever cross its threshold, and for a long moment he simply looked down at her, his expression one of reverence, of wonder. The king of blood and shadow, the tyrant of the obsidian citadel, was on his knees before her. Not in defeat, but in absolute soul-shattering surrender. And Lena, the wolf sent to be his doom, knew with bone-deep certainty that she had just found her true throne. Chapter 11. The world stilled, suspended in the space between a king's surrender and a queen's acceptance. Cassian knelt before her, the great and terrible Blood King, his 1,000 years of pride and pain laid at her feet like a sacrificial offering. The firelight from the adjoining study cast long, dancing shadows across the Spartan room, illuminating the raw vulnerability on his face. He was not asking for forgiveness. He was offering his shattered soul for her to remake or destroy. Lena's heart, the wild, resilient heart of an alpha, ached with a love so fierce and protective it was a physical pain. She reached down, her hands finding his, and gently pulled him to his feet. It was not an act of command, but of invitation. Rise, meet me as an equal. We face this together. He rose, his movements fluid but unsteady, his golden eyes searching hers with a desperate, questioning light. He was asking a question he did not know how to voice. Can you truly accept this? All of it? The monster, the curse, the dying kingdom? Her answer was not in words. It was in the way she drew his face down to hers, her fingers threading through his dark, silken hair. Her lips met his, and this kiss was not the desperate, frantic collision of before. It was a promise. It was the slow, deliberate merging of two worlds. His cold skin was a shock against the warmth of hers, but the bond ignited between them, a bridge of pure, incandescent energy. She poured her strength into him, the the wild, untamed life force of her wolf, the warmth of the sun-drenched forests, the silver light of the full moon. And he, in turn, opened the floodgates of his own soul, not with pain and despair, but with the vast, silent power of his ancient lineage, the quiet strength of the unyielding mountains, the profound, endless depth of the night sky. It was a dance of opposites, a perfect, impossible alchemy. Their clothes seemed to melt away, discarded without thought, barriers to a union that was far more than physical. His hands, which had known only the cold grip of a sword hilt and the weight of a crown, now mapped her body with a reverence that bordered on worship. Every curve, every plane, every scar from her warrior's life was a revelation to him. And her hands, which had been trained to kill, now sought to heal, to soothe the centuries of tension from his powerful frame, to learn the language of his immortal body. As he laid her back upon the bed, the rough spun linen a stark contrast to the silks of her former cage, he hovered over her, his golden eyes glowing with an emotion so profound, it transcended words. It was awe. It was gratitude. It was love. Raw and terrifying and beautiful. "You are my dawn, Lena," he whispered, the words a sacred vow. "After a lifetime of night." Then he came to her, and the two halves of the prophecy finally, irrevocably, became one. The moment their bodies joined, the world dissolved into light and sensation. It was not a gentle merging. It was an explosion, a controlled supernova of power that ripped through the very fabric of the citadel. A wave of energy, visible only to them, erupted from their union. Lena saw it as a torrent of pure liquid silver, the essence of the moon, crashing into a river of molten gold, the fire of a dying star. The two forces met, swirled and intertwined, not fighting for dominance, but weaving together into something new, something whole. A soft, ethereal light filled the room, silver and gold, pulsing in time with their heartbeats. The cold, Spartan chamber was transformed into a sacred space, the air humming with a power that was ancient, and yet newly born. For Cassian, it was a resurrection. Her warmth, her life force, poured into the deepest, coldest parts of his soul, a healing balm on a wound he had thought eternal. He felt the creeping, insidious chill of the withering, not just recede, but burn away in the face of her vitality. It was the feeling of a frozen man stepping into the sun for the first time, a pain so exquisite it was indistinguishable from pleasure. A groan tore from his throat, a sound of pure, unadulterated relief. For Lena, it was an ascension. His ancient power, his millennia of knowledge and experience, flooded her senses. She felt the weight of his memories, not as a burden, but as a foundation. Her wild, fierce spirit was tempered by his ageless wisdom, her mortal lifespan expanding to touch the edges of eternity. Her wolf, which had snarled and fought against him, now lay down at the feet of its king, its mate, its other half, purring with a contentment so deep it resonated through her very bones. They moved together, a perfect, synchronous rhythm, their bodies and souls locked in the ancient dance of creation. The bond between them was no longer a chain or a cord. It was the very air they breathed, the blood that pumped through their veins. They were one being, one power, one soul, forged in the crucible of their shared surrender. As the culmination of their union crested, the light in the room blazed, a silent, beautiful detonation of balanced power. It pulsed outward, a wave of warmth and life that washed through the cold stones of the citadel, a silent promise whispered into the heart of his dying kingdom. And then there was only peace, a profound, bone-deep peace that neither of them had ever known. Lena woke to the sensation of warmth. It was a foreign concept in this citadel of ice and stone. yet it was undeniably real. She was tangled in Cassian's embrace, her head resting on his chest, the slow, steady beat of his unliving heart, a powerful, resonant drum against her ear. The bond was a calm, crystal-clear river flowing between them, and through it, she felt his emotions as if they were her own. A deep, abiding peace, a sense of wholeness, and a love so fierce it was almost overwhelming. She opened her eyes. The first light of dawn was filtering through the window, painting the room in soft shades of rose and gray. It was the most beautiful sunrise she had ever seen. He was awake, watching her, his golden eyes soft, the haunted look finally, blessedly gone. He raised a hand, his fingers gently tracing the line of her jaw. "Good morning, my queen," he murmured, his voice a low, contented rumble. "Good morning, my king," she whispered back, a slow, genuine smile spreading across her face. There were no more secrets, no more tests. In the crucible of their union, all mistrust had been burned away. She knew him. He knew her. "The book," she said, the thought surfacing through the blissful haze. "The ritual." He nodded, his expression turning serious, but without the despair of before. "The union was the catalyst. It forged the weapon. But it is not the cure itself. We are." He sat up, pulling her with him, the linen sheets pooling around their waists. "The final pictogram, the flower blooming from the cracked stone. It is a ritual of restoration. We must take this power, this balance we have created, and channel it into the heart of the poison, into the wellspring." At that moment, a soft, respectful knock came at the door. "Your Majesty," Theron's voice, hesitant but urgent. "Enter," Cassian commanded. The ancient scholar slipped into the room, his eyes immediately falling on the open book on the table, then on the king and his queen, sitting together in the dawn light. A look of profound, tearful relief washed over his ancient face. He had clearly felt the shift in the Citadel's energy, the wave of life that had pulsed from this room. "The Ethel text," Theron said, his voice trembling with excitement as he approached the bed, a scroll clutched in his hand. "I cross-referenced the final pictograms with the scrolls of the First Covenant. It is as you suspected, a ritual of convergence. It requires the Sun King and the Moon Alpha to channel their unified life force into a corrupted source. It will purify it. But the cost—" He hesitated, his gaze falling on Lena. "The cost is immense. The ritual will drain you both, leave you vulnerable for a time, and it must be done at the apex of both your powers, at the zenith of the midday sun, on the day of the full moon." Lena and Cassian exchanged a look. The weight of their new reality settled over them. They had the cure. They had the path. "When is the next full moon?" Lena asked. Theron looked at Cassian, a grim understanding passing between the two old friends. Cassian's jaw tightened. "Tonight," he said, his voice a low, serious rumble. "The hunter's moon. The strongest full moon of the year." The words hung in the air, a death knell to their newfound peace. They had no time to prepare, no time to solidify their new alliance with the Council, no time to hunt down the banished, vengeful Vorlag. The universe was offering them one chance, a perfect convergence of power, and it was now or never. To heal his kingdom, they would have to open their souls to the poison, and in their moment of greatest power and greatest vulnerability, all their enemies would be watching. Chapter 12. The heart of the Citadel was a place of absolute darkness. It was a cavern carved from the living rock at the mountain's core, and at its center lay the wellspring, a perfectly circular pool of water so black it seemed to absorb the very light from the enchanted crystals above. This was the source of their immortality and their curse. The air was not air, but pressure, thick with the weight of millennia, and the faint, sickly, sweet scent of the withering. Tonight, under the brilliant, predatory light of the hunter's moon, filtering through a single, masterfully cut shaft in the cavern's ceiling, this tomb would either be reconsecrated or become their grave. Lena stood beside Cassian at the edge of the pool, their hands clasped. They were dressed not in royal finery, but in simple, unadorned black tunics, the garb of priests preparing for a final rite. Behind them, Theron stood guard, his ancient face a mask of grim determination. Further back, in the shadows of the cavern's entrance, the remaining council members watched, their immortal forms radiating a volatile mixture of desperate hope and profound suspicion. Lena could feel their collective gaze like 1,000 tiny needles against her skin. The moon is at its zenith. Theron's voice was a low, steady anchor in the oppressive silence. The midday sun, your counterpart, he nodded to Cassian, is a memory, but its power resides within your blood. The ritual demands a perfect balance. You must not allow the poison to consume you, nor allow your own power to overwhelm the other. You must become a perfect conduit. Cassian looked at Lena, his golden eyes clear and focused, stripped of all shadows. The bond between them was a calm, powerful sea, a silent language that spoke more than words ever could. He squeezed her hand, a simple gesture that conveyed everything. I trust you. I am with you. Our fate is one. She squeezed back, her silver-gray eyes reflecting his resolve. Together. They stepped onto the low, obsidian altar at the pool's edge and turned to face each other. Following the ritual's instruction, they raised their joined hands, and with their free hands, they reached out, placing their palms over the other's heart. The circuit was complete. Now, Cassian commanded, his voice resonating with the power of the king and the surrender of the mate. They closed their eyes and drew upon the poison. It was an act of supreme will, a willing invitation to damnation. Lena felt the withering rush up from the wellspring, a tide of absolute cold and spiritual decay. It flooded her senses, whispering of despair, of loneliness, of the slow, inevitable unraveling of the soul. It was the collective agony of his entire race, and it sought to extinguish the vibrant, living fire of her wolf. Her body trembled, the warmth of her life force fighting against the creeping, nihilistic chill. Beside her, she felt Cassian falter as her vitality, the anathema to his curse, surged into his half of the circuit. It was like forcing the sun into a creature of eternal night, a pain so searing it threatened to tear him apart. He gritted his teeth, his body rigid, forcing himself to accept the part of her that was his opposite, his cure, and his torment. The cavern began to hum, a low, resonant thrum of immense power being brought to a focal point. A soft, swirling light began to bleed from them, Cassian's pure, ancient gold, and her wild, vibrant silver. The two colors met in the space between their bodies, a vortex of raw, untamed magic. They were balanced on a razor's edge, vulnerable, their souls laid bare. And it was in that perfect, terrible moment of vulnerability that their enemies struck. From the shadows where the council watched, a figure erupted. Vorlag. His face was a twisted mask of vengeful fury, his eyes burning with hatred. He was not alone. A dozen vampires, council members, and guards still loyal to his cause, moved with him, their blades drawn, their expressions merciless. Treason! Theron shrieked, drawing a ceremonial but sharp dagger and placing himself between his king and the traitors. The loyalist guards at the entrance moved to intercept, and the cavern exploded into a symphony of screaming chaos, the clang of steel on steel echoing off the ancient stone. Cassian's eyes snapped open. A guttural, bestial snarl ripped from his throat, the sound of the predator unleashed. The golden light around him flared violently, threatening to overwhelm Lena's silver. He wanted to break the circuit, to release the monster and slaughter the man who dared to attack them in their most sacred moment. No! Lena's voice was not spoken, but a thunderous command through the bond, a queen to her king. "Hold the line!" "Trust me." He looked at her, his face contorted in a silent battle, the beast warring with the mate. He saw the unyielding strength in her silver eyes, the absolute certainty of the alpha. And he did the hardest thing he had ever done in his 1,000 years of life. He let go. He surrendered control of their combined power to her and focused his entire being on holding back the tide of the withering that was trying to consume them both. Vorlage saw his chance. "The king is trapped! Slay the wolf! Break the curse!" he roared, batting Theron aside and lunging for Lena. Lena did not flinch. She was the eye of the storm. With Cassian as her shield against the poison, she became the sword. She took the swirling, chaotic vortex of their combined power and gave it purpose. She was the alpha of the moon, and she would show them the true meaning of the hunt. She didn't just channel the power, she became it. The pure life force of her wolf, amplified by Cassian's ancient, solar-aligned blood, erupted from her. She pushed it outward, not as a gentle wave, but as a concussive, purifying detonation of silver and gold light. The light struck Vorlag mid-lunge. He screamed, a high, thin sound of pure agony. The balanced, life-giving energy was a poison to his imbalanced, stagnant soul. He did not burn. He unraveled. The pure, vital magic tore his corrupted immortality apart at its very seams, and with a final, choked cry, he dissolved into a shower of gray, lifeless dust that settled on the obsidian floor. His followers, caught in the expanding halo of the blast, were thrown back, their blades clattering, their bodies smoking where the light had touched them, their will to fight utterly broken. But the main force of the detonation was directed downwards. The wave of silver-gold energy slammed into the black heart of the wellspring. For a moment, the pool boiled, black and gold and silver churning in a violent, chaotic war. Then, with a final, resonant hum that shook the entire mountain, the darkness broke. The black water cleared, turning a crystal-pure, translucent blue, and from the very bottom of the pool, a soft, gentle light began to glow, a clean, white light of a world reborn. The ritual was done. The last of their strength gone, Lena and Cassian collapsed together, their bodies slumping to the altar, held up only by their embrace. They were utterly drained, trembling and breathless, but they were alive. And they were whole. Theron, bruised but alive, rushed to their side. The remaining council members, their faces a mixture of terror and absolute awe, slowly, hesitantly, approached. They saw the glowing, purified wellspring. They saw the dust of the traitor Vorlag. And they saw their king, holding his queen in his arms as if she were the most precious thing in the universe. One by one, they fell to their knees, not just in fealty to their king, but in reverence for the queen who had been their salvation. Later, in the quiet of their chambers, as the first true, hopeful dawn in 1,000 years streamed through the now unbarred windows, Lena lay in Cassian's arms. The citadel felt different. The oppressive, stagnant air was gone, replaced by a clean, vibrant energy that flowed from the purified wellspring. The curse was broken. "The withering is gone," Cassian murmured, his voice thick with an emotion so profound it had no name. He brushed a strand of silver-streaked hair from her face. "You saved us. You saved me." Lena looked up at him, her heart full. "We saved each other." He leaned down and kissed her, a slow, deep kiss of promises fulfilled, and a future just beginning. "You are more than my mate, Lena of the Silverfang. You are the heart of my kingdom. You are the dawn of my empire." She smiled, her wolf purring in contentment, her alpha spirit finally at peace. She was no longer a wolf in a vampire's world. He was no longer a king of a dying race. They were the beginning of something new, a legend forged in the balance of sun and moon, of blood and spirit. "And you, Cassian," she whispered, her hand over his heart, "are my eternity."